The time draws near as to when Sonic Frontiers will be released to the public and available to everyone. We'll finally have all of our questions and concerns answered and confirmed. With the release being so close to now, it's probably a good time to wonder, should Sonic Frontiers even have the combat it's been touting? Now, when I talk about combat here, I'm not referring to the all or nothing, can you fight or not, because naturally, Sonic games have always featured some level of battle, even in the classics. The simple act of jumping and destroying an enemy is combat to a degree, but when we talk about combat in context to Frontiers, we are exploring the more in-depth mechanics and questioning how deep should a Sonic game really push its combat. For a lot of us, we don't have much hands-on information when it comes to the game feel, though some people have managed to play some public demonstrations and other people have managed to acquire those demonstrations for longer than they were intended, but I am not one of those people, so I can only go off what I have observed. And Sonic Frontiers is pushing its combat layer as one of its major features. Clearly a lot of time has been invested into its combat. The problem is that for some people, that announcement was a red flag, because they don't consider having much combat in a Sonic game as necessary, and if anything, the time Sonic has attempted this in the past has left them with a sour taste in their mouth. There are numerous examples of Sonic trying to do more in-depth combat. One would be Sonic Unleashed with its infamous Werehog, and whilst a lot of people these days perhaps talk about their love for the Werehog, at the time there was a lot of genuine criticism for the Werehog's inclusion, and I was one of the people that was not too fond of the Werehog. For me, it wasn't that I didn't believe combat could work in Sonic. They separated the platforming sections from the battle-focused sections. The issue was that the Werehog combat just felt sluggish, underpowered and slow, and yes, I experimented with all different moves, it just didn't feel good for me. For other people, the issue was that it broke the pace. In Sonic, you're typically always moving one way or another, but those deliberate battle sections I just mentioned as the Werehog meant that you had to stop platforming and moving to fight a bunch of enemies with sizable health meters before you could continue the game you came there for. Sonic Boom Rise of Lyric is another game that had a lot of combat, and it also had a slower gameplay with a higher focus on exploration, which shockingly has quite a few similarities to Sonic Frontiers now that you think about it. However, there are major differences between Frontiers and Rise of Lyric, thankfully, one of which is that Sonic Boom was an unfinished product, and hopefully Sonic Frontiers is not an unfinished product. Another one would be that the Boom game was trying to emphasize its gimmicky Beam grapple hook mechanic alongside switching to 3 other playable characters, so they had to divide up the very limited movesets 4 times, and the creativity just wasn't there. The enemy design was also very rigid. There was only 4 or so different classes of enemies used over and over and over again, whereas we have already seen Frontiers have far more variety in the enemies you encounter, because something based on combat does require a good amount of enemy variety to stop it from getting stale, just as much as the player's own moves and agency are dependent on your creative actions in combat. Since Sonic Frontiers is dedicating a sizable amount of the gameplay to its combat system, you would hope that that system would have enough depth to earn that weight. The problem with having a reliant battle mechanic for your game is that if it's too shallow, if it's too repetitive, and if there aren't enough different avenues to experiment and show your own creative moves, then it won't work. From what we've seen from Sonic Frontiers so far, it's debatable if its combat mechanic will be able to do such. Let me use some comparisons to illustrate my point. Devil May Cry is a video game series heavily focused on its combat, more so than Sonic Frontiers, I should point out, but focused on combat nonetheless. And in that game, the player has access to many moves like the Werehog did, though more fleshed out and polished, I would argue, and the enemies, definitely compared to the enemies of the Werehog, have a lot more going for them as well. And in Devil May Cry, you're really sending out a flurry of moves whilst trying to dodge a flurry of attacks from your opponents, at the same time as taking out hordes of enemies and really dynamic boss fights, with different ways you can take your playable character and different mechanics you can choose to focus on to spice up the combat. Sonic Frontiers does have a good amount of enemy variety, and they do seem to require different ways to take them out, which is a good sign, but compared to Devil May Cry, from what we've seen so far, its combat mechanics are not quite there. Though, Devil May Cry is not the only way you can have a in-depth combat system. Dark Souls, for example, is a game that also has a very mechanically rich combat system, but in a completely different direction, whereas in Dark Souls, the combat is slower, more precise and methodical, or even chaotic at times, but the player themselves has to be very aware of what they're doing and when they are doing it, otherwise they'll be punished severely. So although it's a different flavour of combat to Devil May Cry, both of those games feature very deep combat mechanics. Sonic Frontiers hasn't been shown in its entirety, and we know that there's some skills we haven't seen yet, so there is a chance Sonic will get more involved, shall we say. However, some things such as the recollection of rings being very easy from the gameplay we've seen does cause me to caution on Sonic's combat challenge. Challenge does not necessarily equal depth, but without challenge it's harder to create more meaningful depth, as long as it's fair. And yeah, from what we've seen, I'm not confident that Sonic Frontiers' combat system is going to be absolutely amazing. Though I suppose what really matters is, will it be better than the combat mechanics we've seen so far in the past? The closest one to a platformer would probably be Sonic 06, actually, with Shadow and to a lesser degree Sonic having different ways of dealing a lot of damage to different foes. Most people seem to prefer Sonic over Shadow. I prefer Shadow over Sonic, but that's just me. Most people seem to prefer Sonic over Shadow because he had a less focus on the combat, so people weren't too fond of it there, though it was very lightly touched upon. Frontiers will focus on it far more, so I suppose we will have to see, but my presumption is its combat is definitely not enough to carry the entire game. Though, that's probably why it's not the only aspect of Frontiers, because of course, Frontiers is also trying to use its cyberspace to its advantage. The amount of mileage one would get from the cyberspace depends on the person's experience with the Sonic franchise as a whole. For someone who has played many of the past Sonic games, you may find yourself quite unimpressed with Cyberspace based on what we've seen so far. Why is this? A lot of the stages seem to either take heavy inspiration or just flat out mimic level design from previous Sonic games. Some may say that this is clearly a good sign, because as long as they're taken from good levels, it means Frontiers will have a ton of good levels. But this is unfortunately a very simplistic way of viewing it, as well as sort of dodging the questionable standards of just ripping content from past games into new games, which I don't necessarily agree with there. However, let's focus on the primary question. Taking a level from a different Sonic game into this one has a couple problems with it. The levels were designed for the Sonic and the way he played of the game they originated from, whereas Frontiers is its own base playstyle that needs to somehow accommodate levels from all sorts of different Sonic games of the past, and this will create a very specific problem when it comes to stage design and Sonic's control. Because if they really do take a lot of these stages or pieces of stages as one-to-one, then Sonic isn't going to handle the way you remember. And if you played the original version of the level where Sonic was tailored for it, you're probably going to prefer that feel than to this newer one where you're playing a Sonic that's more generalistic and less specific to that stage. So the more history you have with the series, the less impressive you may find Cyberspace, which is a very ironic situation. And for those of you who haven't played the past, but by the past I even just mean the past 10 years, since that includes most of the boosting games, so you're not safe even if you've only been around for that long. But let's say you haven't played most of any past games, then you do have a large selection of levels. I think we have over 50 from what I hear for Cyberspace. There is a sizable amount there. The combat in Cyberspace seems to play a reduced role, where you're mostly destroying things in one hit, as you would in a traditional boosting stage. Though that does bring up the question again, will this make combat seem like padding in the overworld? Remember, we're asking, should Sonic Frontiers have combat in the first place, in-depth combat? Sonic games typically rely on light combat to break up the platforming, but not to spend too much time on. So a couple games have made exceptions to that, and most of the time those exceptions were received negatively by the public. I myself didn't mind combat, and in fact I do like having more in-depth combat in a Sonic game, or in a platformer in general I suppose. It's just how you go about doing it. Frontiers is certainly putting in the effort, it's just whether the execution will land. So should Sonic Frontiers have combat? It depends on how deep that combat goes and how worthwhile it is. If it does feel like padding, then I would argue that no, it wasn't. Clearly their intention is to make the combat a worthy gameplay mechanic. So it's not that they're not trying to make it interesting, it's whether they succeed in making it interesting. Because if the combat does feel fun and you want to engage with it instead of avoiding enemies because you feel like it just wastes your time, that will be a very unique selling point to Sonic Frontiers amongst other Sonic games, and it will help provide more options for gameplay in the future. It's not inherently a negative thing, it's only if it's executed poorly. Though for some people, Cyberspace would be all they care about, and I can understand why the combat being irrelevant to them would put them off the idea in general. Still, that was about all I had to say on the topic for myself, so please do let me know in the comments below how you feel on the subject. Thank you for watching this video all the way to the end, it really does help out the channel, and if you want to see more content like this from me, please leave a like and share it with your friends. I hope you have a great day, and to see you next time. This is the Mighty Emperor, signing off.